Good afternoon, all. My name is Sophie Hooper, and I will be your host for today's webinar, which is brought to you in collaboration with ARC Workplace Risk. We are collaborating with ARC on a series of webinars and guidance around managing risks in facilities management and property, and you can find our previous episodes on our NTT webinar pages for playback and the slides as well. I'm now joined by the familiar face of the eminent David Hills, who will present on all things risk management and legislative requirements of the prescribed principles for the management of building safety risk. Now, that's quite a mouthful. David will throw a spotlight on the building safety management systems needed and their content. David will explain his full background in a moment during the presentation, but as you know, he is well positioned to talk about his subject given his expertise and engagement with the regulator. I will not waste any more time speaking about it. I just want to, before I give over to David, before I give all controls to David, I would like to remind the audience that you can ask questions. Can you please put them in the Q&A box? You can ask them anonymously, and I would really encourage you to ask the questions as they come up in your mind throughout the presentation. So today we have David's presentation, and after the presentations, we'll take your question. David, let us not delay any further.
Okay.
You have control.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you are all well. My name's David Hills. I am Senior Director of Regulatory Technical and Technology Solutions at ARC Workplace Risk. I've been with ARC for over 24 years. My background is in building control. I am a chartered surveyor. I'm also a fire engineer, and I've done a little bit of structural engineering as well. So my role within the business is to support our clients in preparing for the future, horizon scanning, and really I'm trying to understand what the law means for each of our particular clients. Today, I want to focus very much on risk management and building safety management systems. Now, the two really do work together. So the first thing I intend to do is just to give a very brief introduction, looking at the law in relation to risk management, where we have come from, what we are doing, and what it's leading us to. I'm then going to focus on what's called the prescribed principles. And these are a new set of principles that have been published by the government, which are going to have a significant impact on how we manage not just building safety for higher risk buildings, but we see the fact that actually this is going to actually permeate its way through to other types of property as well. I'm then going to move on to building safety management systems and the Building Safety Act. And then I'm also going to finally look at the role of technology. And my final slide is all about really learning from the fact that we've worked with over 500 clients who we support in respect of not only building safety, but health and safety and fire safety management. And we've seen where some of the pitfalls have manifested themselves and what we should be doing in order to prevent them. Okay, so we're talking therefore about management of health and safety, management of building safety. Now, I always like to go back and start thinking about what's happened in the past. And so let's have a look at some historic failures in safety management. Now, they're not all around buildings. In fact, there is only one specifically around the traditional commercial stroke residential block. But if you take a look at the Challenger space shuttle disaster, there is a fantastic book called Controlling Risk, which does outline the failures in health and safety management in respect of that. And if we can go through to Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill there, we can then look at, or go back even further to Chernobyl, that nuclear explosion, and then of course Grenfell Tower, the fire that we are all acutely aware of, and that we've recently had the phase 2 inquiry report published. Now, all of the investigations into these particular disasters and failures all acknowledge the fact, or they actually partially blame the incident on one, a lack of adequate and formalized management systems. And that includes making sure that everyone is aware of the arrangements that need to be in place, that are in place, and that should be in place towards the same policy. That there is a lack of, or there has been a lack of management oversight, and that we have a very poor safety culture in the organizations that were running or managing those particular disasters. So let's just quickly focus then on Grenfell. We are talking back in 2017, 72 people died, 70 more were injured. It was the largest loss of life in a residential property since World War II, and it's the largest loss of life in any fire within the UK since the Piper Alpha disaster back in 1988. What's really interesting is that the report, which again came out at the beginning of September this year, really has made it very clear that the safety management arrangements for Grenfell were extremely badly run by the ultimate owner of the building and its management arm. That the failures in the management of fire safety was due to a complete and chronic lack of effective management and leadership. The evidence that was presented during that report is pretty damning of some of the individuals who were in control. That the management teams themselves actually paid insufficient attention to matters affecting fire safety management. Many just felt that it's just not an issue that they really had to deal with, and that they just left it and left issues that were in place. And then, in addition to that, emergency management for the building was muddled, was slow, was indecisive, and was piecemeal. All of those elements effectively show that there's a major issue, not only with the management of risk, but also the cultural problems that were very clear within that particular or those particular organizations. So out of all of what we've had over the last 4 or 5 years, we've now got the Building Safety Act. Now, the Building Safety Act is an enabling act. It's a piece of primary legislation, and that was passed back in April 2022. Now, that primary piece of legislation requires, in many instances, secondary legislation in the form of statutory instruments, regulations, to actually be implemented. And a lot of people felt that, oh, the Building Safety Act only applies to higher risk residential blocks, blocks, for example, that contain 7 or more stories, or that are in excess of 18 meters in height, that contain 2 or more dwellings or student accommodation. That actually, though, is a myth. Parts of the primary legislation has or does impact other types of buildings. Section 156, for example, of the Safety Act, the Building Safety Act, actually amends the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, which ultimately actually impacts all types of buildings covered by the scope. So that's commercial, retail, office, and any other workplace as well. So the Act, the primary legislation, relies on that secondary legislation, which in some way also relies upon approved guidance. And today, what I've tried to do is also use some of the approved guidance that's been issued by the regulator and by the HSE relating to building safety management. So that I've focused on those particular areas. So that secondary legislation has and is still currently passing through Parliament. I think it's also very clear that we ought to be very aware of some of the recommendations that came out of the Grenfell inquiry report. It is not beyond the realms of imagination that we are going to see additional secondary legislation coming out because of that, whether it's relating to competence or whether it's relating to the actual definition or the scope of the actual act itself. But let's just focus on secondary legislation. So at the moment, there are about 27 pieces of secondary legislation relating specifically to building safety. We've got additional legislation relating to the management of architects and architect legislation as well. And as I say, there's much more that we should expect that will be coming. So these are turbulent times. These are times where we are going to see significant change, and we are going to continue to see that change as the Act comes on board and as the changes to the Act actually manifest themselves. But today, I want to focus on one particular piece of the secondary legislation, and that's the Higher Risk Buildings Management of Safety Risk, etc., England regulations back from last year. Just one word of caution. These regulations only apply, as the name suggests, to England. And just so we are all very clearly aware, Wales, although the Building Safety Act applies to Wales, Syneth have not decided, how they are going to be implementing the Act. And so we are due early next year to actually hear from the Welsh Government on their approach to this whole thing. So we're talking, therefore, about this particular piece of legislation and how we manage building safety risks. So let's just quickly then focus on what actually do we mean by building safety risks. Section 62 of the primary legislation, the Building Safety Act, defines building safety risks as a risk to the safety of persons in or about a building arising from any of the following occurring regards the building. And they start off with the spread of fire, and they then move on to structural failure. So when we are talking about building safety management, we are talking about the management of the spread of fire and structural failure only. The government gave themselves the option to add any other prescribed matter. And I think it's really important that that allowance to change the future scope of the regulatory regime is there. It's flexible. It allows the Secretary of State to change that over time. So if you can imagine that the way that we develop things is that we manage and we regulate by disaster. I think if you can see effectively, if we have another disaster, we are going to see a change, and the regulations allow that. So one thing I would suggest is, whilst today we're focusing in on fire safety and structural failure, I think it will be folly of us if we just ignore the fact that that definition and therefore the requirements will and can over time change, and we could see a change in that particular scope. So not only do we expect to see a change in scope in respect of the buildings following the Grenfell Tower inquiry report, but there is a likelihood at some stage that we are going to see a change in the definition of what we call building safety risks. Okay, so that's the risks. That's how we've got to where we are. Let's move on to actually what we mean by risk management and building safety management. Well, again, going back to the primary legislation, Section 84 of the Act sets out 5 very key requirements on how we should be managing building safety risks. The first one is the most important part of a safety case report, for example. In a safety case report, you really want to make sure that you are narrating all of the evidence to ensure that, as the accountable person for an occupied higher risk building, that you've taken all of those reasonable steps to do 2 things. Firstly, to prevent a building safety risk from materializing in respect of the areas that you are responsible for. So that recognizes that buildings could have more than one person who have a responsibility. And then accepting the fact that risks will materialize, things will happen. And so we need to therefore be reducing the severity of any incident resulting from those risks materializing. And again, when we're talking about building safety risks, we are talking about fire and structure at the moment. So that's the first part of the need to manage risk. The next one, part B of this section, basically suggests to accountable persons that actually you do understand, don't you, that you may need to carry out works. If your risk assessments, for example, highlight the need for action, then you have got to take that action, or you have got to take some action. So the Act itself makes it very clear that the accountable person will have to carry out works where they are responsible. Part C of the this particular section says that when you are taking those steps, when you are managing those risks, then the accountable person must act in accordance with what's called the prescribed principles. And I'm going to move on to the prescribed principles in a few moments, so I won't deal with it right now. That when you are taking those steps, that those steps must be taken promptly. Now, there's no definition for prompt, but what the government and what the regulator is looking for is that you're not just undertaking an assessment or an inspection or a piece of maintenance and then leaving the problem for a year or so. They want people to be able to take the action in a very prompt manner, risk-based. And so that prompt element really needs you to be able to set out those arrangements, set out those protocols, determine exactly what you are going to do. And the final element of this is all about the accountable person. And what they must do effectively is to make and give effect to arrangements for the purpose of ensuring the effective planning, organization, control, monitoring, and review of the steps taken in respect of this section. It's a bit of a mouthful, but effectively what the government have said there in guidance that has been published relating to safety management systems is that actually this is all about safety management systems. This is all about making sure that you have got those arrangements and the systems in place to ensure that you are preventing those building safety risks materializing, that if they do materialize, that you are reducing the severity, that where you've got steps to take, you know what action needs to be taken, that you are doing it in a very particular way, prescribed within law, and that you are undertaking those steps in a prompt manner. This is a really important part of the primary legislation. And actually, it is, again, not beyond the realms of imagination that you can see that these particular requirements could permeate through into other types of buildings. We've got a building safety regulator that sits within the health and safety executive. The building safety regulator is responsible for higher risk buildings, but the health and safety executive look after all other workplaces. And so it's, again, I would suggest that it's really, really important that we actually start thinking about how this whole approach to building safety management and the prescribed principles that need to be adopted, how they could be applied to other types of building. So let's then look at the prescribed principles. How should we be going about managing risk? Again, initially within higher risk buildings, but again, I think when you go through these particular list of effective 10 principles that should be adopted, you will see that actually these could be applied to other types of buildings. And in fact, in our opinion, ARC certainly believes that you should be applying these across all types of buildings. The prescribed principles are good risk management. So what are these prescribed principles? Now, they are in order. There are 10 of them, and they're in order of what the government believe is the most effective. And so the first principle that we need to adopt under the higher risk buildings management and safety England regs requirements is that we should be avoiding, where possible, building safety risks. So that's the first principle. The second principle is that we should be evaluating or assessing building safety risks that cannot be avoided. And that's therefore designed to identify all of the proportionate measures required to either address a particular risk, reduce it, and therefore reduce the severity, to mitigate or actually control fully those particular risks. Principle 3 is about combating building safety risks at source. And again, it's about introducing the proportionate measures to, again, address, reduce, mitigate, and control those risks, but at the earliest opportunity. So we're not waiting for things to happen. We are not waiting for a particular time period. We are making sure that we are dealing with these risks at the earliest opportunity. Now, the fourth prescribed principle is to make sure that we have suitable and proportionate systems in place for effective inspection, testing, and maintenance of the efficacy of all of the measures that are in place. So all of the systems that are in place to support fire safety and structural safety, all of the equipment, all has to be going through a full inspection, testing, and maintenance regime. The fifth prescribed principle is about giving collective protective measures priority over individual protective measures. So what does that actually mean? What we're talking about here is the fact that there are layers of protection. Normally within any building, that building will never ever rely upon a single fire safety measure or a single structural safety measure, or let's be honest, any other type of measure when we're talking about Legionella, asbestos, gas safety, electrical safety. We always tend to have more than one layers of protection. And what the prescribed principles want us to do is to actually give those collective protective measures priority over just dealing with an individual element. We should not therefore just be focusing on, for example, fire alarm systems. If we've got a problem with our fire alarm system and we're suggesting a protective measure to make changes, well, how does that affect the other layers of protection? How does that affect the other pieces of equipment? And it's really important we take that collective view. So moving on then, the sixth prescribed principle is adapting to technical progress. And that's making sure that we understand that things change. Things will always move. If we were to turn around and say 10 years ago, then a number and the type of electric vehicles, for example, was very, very small. We weren't introducing electric charging stations in residential blocks or in commercial blocks or in car parks or in petrol stations, but we are now. And those present new risks. So we therefore need to be able to adapt the way that we manage risk in respect of technology changes as those changes occur, but preferably before those changes occur. So we therefore need to be able to consider and horizon scan on what's actually happening in respect to technology. What's actually happening in the systems and the services that we are providing within our buildings. We've got to adapt to that technical progress. This one always makes me laugh. This one's number 7, and this one basically says that where reasonable to do so, we need to replace the dangerous with the non-dangerous or less dangerous. I think that really focuses ourselves onto, for example, things such as external walls. So there are going to be instances, for example, within external walls that we have maybe some dangerous or combustible insulation. And it's about how we replace them or how we actually adjust those and actually remove the actual danger from the issue, or actually reduce the level of danger. So, for example, we have one client who had a system where they had a Kingspan polyisocyanates insulent behind an ACM cladding system. But the building is only 4 stories high. And therefore, under the regulations at the time, it was perfectly acceptable to have the cladding. It just wasn't acceptable to have the insulants. And so what the client has looked to do is actually pump insulation into the void, but maintain somehow a cavity, to look at how they can encapsulate the PIR, the polyisocyanate insulant. Now, again, probably not a great example, but that's where they looked for a non-dangerous or a reduced dangerous solution to a particular problem. The next one is all about considering your impact, or the impact of what you're doing, and the layers of protection and the way that you manage risk on residents, and that you carry out engagement with residents. And there's a whole host of guidance and legislation about how you engage with residents and how you ensure that that is in place. That number 9 is all about making sure that any employee within your employment, or any person working on, in, or near your particular building, is provided with instructions and information as to the types of risk. We often produce for a number of clients what we call a contractor site safety pack. And effectively, it is not a risk assessment, but it actually highlights the types of risks and the types of issues that need to be considered by contractors, by employees, when undertaking work in or near that particular building. Now, the last principle is, again, one of the most important principles, because I don't think we've heard the last of this particular element. And that is to ensure that any person who's responsible for assisting compliance with the duty under Part 4 of the Act, which basically is all about managing existing buildings, has the relevant competence. And competence has been measured, been mentioned yet again within the new code, the new Grenfell Tower Inquiry report. So, just to continue this particular part, what the Act then says, what the regulation says, is that the person who has a relevant competence, where they are an individual, will be able to prove that by having the required skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours necessary to perform the functions for which they are responsible in a satisfactory manner. But not everybody is going to have an individual. So there are situations, for example, the regulations and the prescribed principles acknowledge where if that person is not an individual, then the person has, or the organization has, the organizational capacity to ensure that the functions for which it is responsible for are performed in a satisfactory manner. And then it talks about the fact that an individual who is in training is deemed to have the relevant competence if they are being adequately supervised by a person with the relevant competence when performing that function. When we talk about this, and we talk about the fact that that's within the secondary legislation, and we do have now approved guidance. So we have PAS 8673, which sets out clear competence requirements for the management of safety in residential buildings. That deals very specifically with the individual. And then we've also got the Building Safety Alliance, who have looked at producing their own guide, extremely good guide on organizational capability. It's about how we deal with management system standards in respect of competence and competence assurance. So if you haven't got those documents, I would strongly urge you to have a look at them. They are extremely good, and will support you in developing the level of competence that you need for your particular building. But let's then just look right to the very end now at the different layers of protection that these prescribed principles provide. I want you to imagine this, that you have a hazard, and that hazard is that you could have a fire within an apartment. Now let's start looking at the layers of protection that we are talking about here. We could have compartmentation. More than likely, you will have compartmentation, compartment walls surrounding that particular apartment. And in that compartment wall, you'll have another layer of protection because you will have or a need for an opening. So we provide that opening with a fire door. We may also have another layer of protection within that whole process, and that flat is actually supported by the use of a smoke detection or warning system. We may have a fourth safety feature, which actually means that we could have, for example, a fire suppression system. Now, all of those elements, the compartment walls, the fire doors, the smoke detection and warning, the fire suppression systems, all need to be maintained and tested to make sure that they are performing properly. That's your fifth layer. Now, the persons who are actually undertaking that maintenance have got to be competent to do so. And that will be your sixth layer. So when we're talking about these layers of protection, it's really important that we don't just focus on one particular part. And again, although ordered from most to least effective, the principles should not, as I said, be considered in isolation. They interact with each other. They provide those layers of protection. It's effectively meaning that we've got to take, when it comes to risk management now, and when we come to develop fire and building safety management systems, that we start to think on a more holistic basis. We've got to start to think outside of the box. We cannot just focus on one particular area. I've got this area. I'm responsible for this. Well, actually, by doing that, you are actually affecting the other layers of protection. And we've got to think of those protective and preventative barriers. There's going to be numerous ones. As I said earlier, we're not going to find a building which has a single fire safety or a single asbestos base or a single electrical, single gas or single structural feature that is the only feature protecting the residents within it. So again, the last element in respect of the safety principles is that, as the government have made it very clear, we cannot rely upon short-term, old and outdated approaches. What they mean by that is that the government have made it very clear that they are not happy, they're not comfortable with the use of waking watch. They see that as old, outdated approach that in fact doesn't really work. And so when we come to write our safety management system, we've got to start thinking about these layers of protection, the layers of work that we do when we actually come to actually manage a particular building. So they're the prescribed principles. That's the changes that are occurring in respect of risk management. Let's look now at safety management systems. We have a saying within our business. I'm sure it comes from somebody else that said it in the past, but we've adapted it for our particular process. And we don't believe that you can have safety in the process without people, and that you can't have safety in the people without leadership, and that you can't have safety in the leadership without commitment. And effectively, safety management starts with management commitment. And I think if we have that in mind as we develop this whole process, you'll see that it has to be led from the top. Safety management systems and building safety management systems have to be led by senior managers. Senior managers have to set the tone. Senior managers have to show the business why it's so important. Senior managers have to act in a way that's very, very importantly, safety minded. So let's go back to the act again then. So what does the safety management system effectively require? Again, looking at the guidance, the need to make and give effect to arrangements for the purpose of ensuring effective planning, organization, control, monitoring and review of the steps taken means a need for building a safety management system. And as I said, there is a guidance note issued by the building safety regulator that actually recommends a very simple approach. Now, you could go down the route of an ISO 45001 management system or another certified system through perhaps BS 9997 or the International Labour Organization's Occupational Safety and Health approach. But what the government have actually suggested is that we need to start taking a very simple approach to this. And they've devised this around a plan, do, check, act model. And the guidance that's actually out there makes it very clear that initially you should be setting out your statement of intent. What and how are you going to manage this whole process, and how are you going to do it? What's our statement of intent? How are we actually going to communicate that management commitment? It's about making sure that we set out and plan to implement that policy. It's about making sure that we profile our risks by actually understanding those risks. So it's not just about undertaking fire risk assessments and general risk assessments, which everybody does. But what about structural risk assessments as well? More than likely, most organizations that we work with have not undertaken structural risk assessments in the past. And that's a new process that a lot of people are having to navigate their way through. It's about making sure that you have the right roles and responsibilities, that you've got the right cooperation, coordination, and competence control and communication arrangements. It's about setting those down in writing and making sure that everybody is aware of what duties they've got to do, when they've got to do it. It's about then implementing that system. It's about making sure that your policies, your procedures are doing what they need to do. That actually you've got the right technology and the tools to support you to maintain and train your staff, that you've got competent staff. But then it's about making sure that you measure your performance. It's about how you monitor and identify all of the potential opportunities, the problems, the good things that are actually happening, and then understand the causes of issues, both on an active and reactive basis. You then got to think about how you're going to investigate, and your organizational elements, your arrangements, your policies, your procedures should set out a very clear strategic approach to how you investigate issues, how you go about determining why things went wrong, and how good are things actually working. It's about then reviewing your performance, and again, having structured audits on a regular basis and reviewing your plans, your policies, your assessments against your stated objectives within your policy. And it's at that stage you can then decide how you are going to act and learn the lessons from the past before we start the whole process off again. Is our policy still the right policy? Is our statement of intent still the right thing? So safety management systems are a requirement of the Building Safety Act. And very importantly, a lot of people don't realize that actually they are an integral part to your safety case report. You really do need to get your safety management system right if you're going to get the right level of protection and narrative within your safety case report. Now, my next slides I'm going to rush through because they're in the slide deck and they really are just taking you through the types of things that you should be looking at as you go through the development of your safety management system. We should be planning, so we should be determining our policy and then plan for the implementation. But we should be doing that based on the building safety measures that are applicable to that building and how you want to manage those. Your policy statement should set out how you want to develop your management system, both now and in the future, and how and what steps you're going to do in order to achieve that. Now, a good, as I said earlier, good, effective safety management system relies upon leadership. And so therefore, it's got to be driven by the leaders. They've got to be involved. But let's be honest, everybody has to be involved. And everyone needs to understand what their roles and responsibilities are, no matter where they are. It doesn't matter how far away from the coalface you are. Everyone needs to know. Now, you already probably have those in place in your health and safety policy, in your fire safety arrangements. You'll have individual job descriptions. But you really do need to make sure that it's very clear what needs to be in place. What level of competence, what skills, knowledge, experience, and importantly, what behaviors are needed in order for you to be able to perform them and very importantly, what resources you have in place. If we then move on to the do part, it's about making sure that you've undertaken your risk assessment, that you understand and very importantly accept that actually, do you know what? Individual buildings are different and that we do need to treat them in a different way. We need to treat them with those multiple layers of protection. Very rare, even in buildings that are next door to each other, built at the same time, very rare that you often find exactly the same levels of protection and exactly the same layers of protection that are in place. So again, think about your maintenance systems. Think about how you, what systems you have in place, what technology you are using in order to manage scheduling, the undertaking of actions and recording of those actions, and how you can keep that evidence and keep those records, because they are important. They are part of your golden thread. They are part of your safety case. And it's really important that we have those in place. It's about making sure that as well, that we formalize how we manage our supply chain, because we are responsible for their competence. And so therefore, we've got to be able to understand how they are competent and how we can prove that. And we also need to think about how we manage change. So we need to set out how we intend to manage that change, both to the building, whether it's a residence change, whether it's their needs, whether it's a change to your management system, or whether it's changes because you've had a legislative change or a guidance change. You need to understand the impact of that change. And again, change management is a really important policy and procedure that needs to be included in every safety management system. In addition to that, how are we managing emergencies and how are we going to describe those? It's about how we go through the monitoring process, both active and reactive basis, and decide actually what actually is acceptable in respect of our safety performance. It's about how we update safety managers, how we involve the management team in understanding all of this process, and how we go through those series of audits and reviews. And then it's about acting. It's about making sure that actually what we're doing is effective. It's about making sure that we are hitting the performance. And when there is a dip, what have we got to do in order to bring that back up to the process? And as I said, it relies upon and must involve the leadership team and senior managers as well. So that's the plan, do, check, act approach. Again, all of those will be contained within the slides. The slide deck, so you'll be able to see all of the different areas. But I think one of the important elements that the guidance and the regulator has made it very clear is it's about proportionality. It's about making sure that the management system is right for your building, not necessarily right for all of your buildings. It's about being appropriate to one specific building. So the guidance is very clear. Base your risk assessment, base your management system, on a risk assessment of your building. And it's, again, we should be looking at the safety management system on a proportional basis based upon those hazards. What's the point in having a procedure in respect of ladders, for example, if you don't have any ladders on site? What's the point in having procedures and arrangements in place for managing gas safety when there's no gas in a building? So base the safety management system on the hazards that are applicable to your specific building. And again, that's going to be based on lots of different things. It's not just obviously the assessment, but other things that could affect your decisions on how you build your safety management system will be about the complexity of that building. It'll be the complexity of the measures that are in place to protect. It could be based on the number of buildings or the size of your organization. It could also be based upon how you manage. Are you using third parties and contractors to manage those or maintain those measures? And very importantly, it's about the resident profile as well. What type of residents do you have? Do you have a large proportion that, for example, are disabled or are vulnerable? Then again, you'll need to make sure that you have those processes and procedures in place. And at the end of the day, when you produce these documents, when you produce these management systems, they've got to be concise and they've got to be easily understood, because it doesn't matter who you are within an organization, you will have to read a procedure at some stage. You will have to understand what it is that you need to do, how you need to do it, and why you are doing it. So one of the areas that we spoke about, and I just want to finish off on this, is all about the role of technology in safety management. Technology plays a really key role in enabling anybody, whether it's persons managing through the Building Safety Act or any other position, and how you can improve how you perform. So, for example, you will have things such as the golden thread or your centralized data. You'll have your maintenance and PPM schedule. You will be managing those assets and those resources. You will want a system that will be able to manage deadlines and track the controls and the actions that you're taking. It's about managing the risk assessments, about managing any incident that you have within the building. It's about compliance. It's about how do we determine how compliant we are and where we are needing to actually undertake some action. It's all about how we report and inspect and audit ourselves. It's actually, at the end of the day, it's all about the levels of control that you have, the coordination requirements that are in place, how you communicate within your organization, and the levels of competence that you have within your organization or within your supply chain as well. So there are benefits of leveraging technology, and that technology is going to come in many different forms, whether it's a system such as we produce, which is called CUDA, which is designed for risk management with a building safety a pack that's appended to it, or whether you're using something else, whether it's a series of spreadsheets or some other system. There will always be benefits for leveraging and improving your technology for building safety management. It will improve transparency and visibility. It will help you automate those repetitive tasks and processes. It will allow you to track those risk management elements. And again, there are lots of other elements such as how you can mitigate and reduce risk, but actually ensure that your data collection is consistent and accurate. Technology will also help you, as I say, centralize your risk management data so you've got a single source of truth, that golden thread of information. It's about making sure that the documents that you've got aren't duplicates, are not older versions that you shouldn't be relying upon. So it's what we call document hygiene. It's about managing knowledge and managing knowledge transfer. It's all about making sure that the flow of your management system works, because your management system needs to move. It needs to move. It needs to allow you to manage your processes based upon your particular building. It should improve engagement, and it will improve decision making. And lastly, and very importantly, you will get more done. One of our clients showed us that they'd actually saved 40% of their time by applying our systems to supporting them in their building safety and risk management processes. 40% of their time they were able to prove. My last slide before any questions, and apologies, Sophie, I'm just a few seconds over, but I do want to very quickly talk about the pitfalls, because we often see organizations build their safety management systems, they've got them, and it doesn't work, or they haven't implemented it properly. First thing, we have to understand that, as I said before, this starts at the top and it ends at the top. The senior management team have to believe, they have to want this. That's a difficulty sometimes, because many senior managers, this isn't their focus. Their focus is finance. Their focus is operational control. Risk management has got to go across the board. It's got to go. It starts at the top, it ends at the top. And it needs to involve everybody if it's going to fully work. Everybody needs to know their part, and it's making sure that each operative, each person, each employee knows where they are, what they are required to do, what they're required not to do as well. It's not just about training. Now, training is important, but you have to have that belief that this is going to be good, not only for yourself, but for others as well. But one thing I will turn around and say that these systems and how you apply these systems, they don't just happen by themselves. It needs corporate will, it needs leadership, it needs commitment, it needs a budget, and it needs resources. And at the end of the day, everybody needs to see the commitment from the leadership. If you take one of the plan, do, check, act requirements out of your management system, I will tell you straight away that system will not work. It's been seen often where people have actually taken out the investigation process. We don't want to go down that process. We don't want to be measuring ourselves. Well, actually, that doesn't allow you to improve. That doesn't allow you to ensure that the actual management system isn't just a tick box exercise, that it actually delivers. And that's the most important thing. The management system has to deliver. Conscious of time, if you take one of the C's out as well, it doesn't work. You can have the best control of anything, but poor cooperation means that your system won't work. You can have great coordination, but with poor communication, it just doesn't work. I would strongly suggest that you take document hygiene very seriously. You need to make sure that you've got the right document, that single source of truth. And again, please, this is not just a tick box exercise. So to leave you then, your system needs to ensure that you've got a safety policy, a statement of intent, that you have got the right people doing very clearly the roles and responsibilities. You have all of your policies, your procedures and arrangements in place so you can assess, maintain all of your remediation, both on a proactive, reactive basis, that you have a digital management system in some way, shape or form that will save you time, that will reduce the issues that you have with this, and that you make sure that you have things such as mandatory occurrence reporting, which is not the same as RIDDOR, and good management reporting, auditing, and review processes. Sophie, questions? Do we have any?
Do we have any, David? I'm afraid we might not get through them all.
Okay.
So let's get started then. Thank you for sending in the questions. If we don't get through them all, we will follow up with an article like we did last time. So please keep them coming so we can capture them all. But we've got a few questions as to scope of the legislation, actually. The first question is one around territorial legislation, because obviously, the legislation applies to England. Wales is also reviewing parts of it. What about Scotland? Will Scotland be reviewing their fire safety legislation?
Scotland are in a continual review of their fire safety legislation. They have reviewed, they have updated their legislation, both building regulation and management legislation. So yes, they are doing that. Northern Ireland hasn't yet, mainly because the Northern Ireland executive has been a bit moribund in the past few years. That's changed. They are starting to now get up to speed. But yeah, we will see changes. We will see changes in respect of Wales. Wales have made it very clear that they are not particularly happy with the arbitrary approach of height or number of stories. And Wales have made it very clear that they are looking to actually register any building, any residential block containing 2 or more flats or apartments will have to be registered. What that means, we don't know yet, but we will see changes, and those changes are going to occur certainly in the next year.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Dave, for the question. We do have a fire safety management guidance that also looks at the different devolved countries and has got a list about relevant legislation for those countries. We've got a question from Elizabeth around the meaning of residence, whether it is residence in the sense of living in the property, or is it building occupier for commercial properties?
Okay, so at this particular moment, the Act does not apply to commercial properties. The only part that has had an impact is Section 156, as I said, which amended the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, which does apply. So at the moment, residents, we are just talking about relevant persons within the building, a resident who actually lives within the building, or an owner of one of the apartments or flats within a particular residential block. So that's the definition in respect of that.
Brilliant. Now, we had a really good question around the feedback from the building safety regulator on tranche one safety case submissions. Now, David, I know that you've been helping people with their submission. Any commentary that you are willing to share around this?
One of the reasons why we did this and recommended that we looked at building safety management systems is that in our experience, the vast majority of people who are undertaking their safety case reports are not adequately dealing with building safety management and do not have a building safety management system in place. So I would strongly urge you, if you're going to or are submitting your building assessment certificate and submitting the safety case report as part of that, that you need to be able to articulate within your safety case report how you go about managing the building, how you go about managing competence, how you go about managing your supply chain, how you go about managing emergencies, how you and what is your statement of intent? What is it you are doing in respect of engaging as well with residents, and how, and what processes and procedures? Because it's very interesting. What we're seeing is that the vast majority of those who, where they have been registered, where they have submitted their assessments, their assessment certificate application, sorry, and therefore the safety case report, that is the key element. Building safety management. You need to be able to articulate that very clearly. So that's strongly the area I would suggest you need to focus on. Of course, there are others. Structural risk assessments is one area, making sure you have the right level and degree of fire risk assessment as well. But certainly building safety management has been for us, in our experience, the key.
Thank you, David. That's very helpful. Brian is asking a question around the applicability of the secondary legislation yet. So are you saying secondary legislation is not yet law because it is still under consultation and therefore some of the ACOPs are not available to reference? So
No,
to what extent is the Building Safety Act currently active law?
it is in the main, in respect of part 4, in the main, mostly in place now. We are waiting for one particular piece of secondary legislation. That secondary legislation that I showed earlier on that slide, all of which has been passed through Parliament, all of which is enshrined within the law, whether it's commencement of parts of the Act or whether it's very specific statutory instruments that actually implement part of the Act. We are waiting for one more in respect of directors, what's called building safety directors. Whether that actually goes through Parliament or not, we don't know. Obviously, with the new government, we're waiting to find out, or whether they are going to wait to decide how they're going to deal with some of the recommendations that come out of the Grenfell inquiry. But yeah, the secondary legislation is in place, and all of the guidance that comes out of that secondary legislation is available on the government's website.
Thank you very much, David. I am actually really afraid that we've run out of time to answer all of the very good questions that are remaining. So we will pick those up and answer them via an article later on. David, thank you very much for this insightful session. And also a special thanks for mentioning PAS 8673 on individual competence and the Building Safety Alliance Organizational Capability Standard. IWFM has played quite a critical role in the development, so I really encourage people to check both of them out. I also would like to thank ARC Workplace Risk as our partners to help you make that wonderful advice and guidance available. We will still be developing guidance together with ARC Workplace Risk that will follow in the near future. A recording will be available for anyone who wants to listen again or share with friends and colleagues, and we'll also make sure to publish the slides on the website. Thank you as well to the webinar support team. You don't see them, but they keep the magic going. For people who are interested more, the screen is showing our course that we have on the Building Safety Act and what FMs do need to know, including about who the accountable person is, how you can help move residents along into cooperation, etc., etc. Now, if you found today useful, we also have got a poll so that we and our partners can get in touch with you after the session. So if you could please take some time to answer this question, then we will obviously act accordingly. And thank you very much for participating in this. Now, moving on to the next event, we are very excited about our next webinar on sustainability, which we will use to celebrate the publication of our sustainability survey report. We are publishing the report next week, and then the webinar will take place the weekend after, the week after, not the weekend after. We wouldn't expect you to join those weekends. We also have got CPD numbers available for people participating in this section. So that's the next slide. If we could share people thank you very much, the CPD number for today's event. So that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you very much for sticking with us. Apologies for slightly running over time. And I do hope to see you again next time. Until then, thank you.